Welcome to part 6 of Chinese religion. This part actually focuses on the philosophy and politics of the Qin Dynasty. The Qin Dynasty lasted from 221 to 206 BCE. This was after the state of Qin had conquered the other warring states, thus ending the warring states period. The main reasons for Qin's triumph was the superiority of their army and the strategic thinking of the first Qin emperor, Qin Shihuang, who was the ruler of the state of Qin. The system of government under the Qin dynasty was different from what had happened during the Zhou, and it had a lasting effect on Chinese society. Under the Zhou kings, they did have ministers, but a lot of authority was delegated to a feudal hierarchy of nobles. So the different states or provinces or duchies of the kingdom ruled by dukes and other nobles. Under the imperial system of the Qin, the emperor ruled primarily through a bureaucracy. So that was an organization of ministers who were appointed by the emperor and by his chief associates. And there was also a prime minister or chief minister who was responsible for a lot of the day-to-day operations of the government, but the emperor did not delegate authority to hereditary lords who could build up their own power base independent of the emperor's patronage. This system of government influenced later dynasties of China, despite the fact that the Qin did not last very long. The feudal nobility did persist. There were still kings and dukes and marquises and other nobles after the Qin, but a lot of power administratively was in the hands of the appointed ministers. Qin Shihuang was the name of the first Qin emperor that he assumed after he unified China. One of his accomplishments was to build the ancient version of the Great Wall of China along the western border. There had been smaller walls previous to this, so he built upon those and connected them and formed one very large border wall. This was to protect against invasion from nomads from Central Asia, which plagued China throughout its history up until modern times. The ancient Great Wall is not the same as the modern Great Wall, but it is the ancient precursor. Qin Shi Huang, despite his efficacy of uniting the country, had an authoritarian style of rule. For example, he imposed fairly heavy taxes on the people, including labor tax, in which commoners would be forced to work on building projects such as roads or canals or a giant tomb complex dedicated to Qin Shi Huang. The tomb complex is fairly famous in modern times because it was excavated in the 20th century, and there were a lot of very impressive finds, including an army of terracotta warriors, as well as ritual vessels, bronze swords, and many other items. This was a massive project, and this type of thing, forcing people to work on this, taxing them heavily, also issuing harsh punishments, often enslavement or the death penalty for those who broke his laws or disobeyed him. While they had the intention of creating obedience and order, they created a lot of resentment. So there were rebels who sprung up against the first Qin emperor, and this eventually would undo the Qin dynasty. Qin Shi Huang only lived about 49 years, and ironically, he might have hastened his demise in an attempt to give himself immortality. So he supported alchemists in his court. These were scholars who studied the art of transforming human life into immortality using cinnabar, a compound containing mercury and other elements. But because the potions that he consumed were laced with mercury, they may have indeed hastened his demise. During the Qin dynasty, the main school of thought that was influential in the government was Feizi, which means school of the law, also called legalism. According to Feizi, social order is created through enacting the correct laws and through appointing ministers who have expertise, who know what they're doing. So unlike the Confucians, the school of the law does not say that the ruler must be virtuous or the ruler must adhere to the customs of the early Zhou kings in order for society to be peaceful and prosperous. It's more of a technocratic problem of crafting the right laws and appointing the right people. People who have the skills as opposed to those who are personally connected or who are family members of the ruler. Also, unlike Moism, which focused on benefiting the common people, the general sense of the school of the law is that the ruler is governing largely for his own benefit. I mean, the people are supposed to or are expected to benefit as well if the society is orderly, but the main goal seems to be to have an efficient administration in order to increase the size of the kingdom, the power of the ruler, etc. So this was the school of thought that was favored by Emperor Qin Shihuang and his chief ministers. You can see on the right is a bronze plaque with an edict of the second Qin emperor, Qin Shi. This represents the legalist principle of making laws widely proclamated and easy to understand so that they could be efficiently followed by the people. Han Feizi was one of the founders of Fajia, and he was a student of the Confucian scholar Xunzi. However, even though he was a student of Xunzi, he did not become a Confucian. He developed his own philosophy. So Han Feizi believed that virtue is rare in people and can't be relied upon either in the ruler or the common people. So he thought the Confucian philosophy of hoping or trying to engineer a case where a ruler is virtuous is like watching a tree stump waiting for a rabbit. This was an ancient proverb evidently, that's based on the story of a farmer who's working in his field, and one day he sees a rabbit hopping along, and the rabbit accidentally bumps its head on a tree stump and dies right in front of the farmer. This actually is pleasing to the farmer because he's able to make his dinner out of the rabbit. However, the next day he goes out to his field and just waits by the tree stump, expecting it to happen again. So this proverb illustrates the folly of someone who is counting on a rare or chance event from recurring. And according to Han Feizi, because virtue is so rare, it's not the basis for a plausible political philosophy. There has to be another way of creating an effective government or stable society. Unlike the Confucians, Han Feizi also rejected tradition as a reliable guide to government. Confucius had thought that the ways, the customs of the early kings of the Zhou and other ancient kings should serve as a guideline for later rulers. And the Moists, even though they were somewhat similar to Fajia in their emphasis on the technocratic aspect of politics and rulership, they too projected their ideas back to the sage kings, and so portrayed themselves as the correct interpreters of tradition. Han Feizi thought that this was foolish for two reasons. First of all, society evolves, times have changed, so perhaps the ancient traditions will not be relevant to the modern day. And also, he said, because there's different conflicting interpretations of tradition, which can't be resolved because of the limited information about the past, it's foolish to even try to identify what the tradition is. So Han Feizi had a different view of tradition. He focused more on just what laws enacted now will benefit the ruler. Han Feizi's philosophy of the law is that there's no law above the ruler, that there's no heavenly law or principle or any moral law that should constrain the ruler. This was a lot different both from Confucianism and from Moism. So Confucius thought that there was a heavenly principle that the ruler needs to abide by. Otherwise, there's going to be no check on the ruler's own greed or corruption or abuse of power. And the Moists also appeal to the benefit of the people, material benefit for all people, as a higher moral standard that you can use to judge the ruler. But Han Feizi seems to have regarded laws as social construct, something created by a ruler or a social institution, and there's no law outside of whatever the ruler or the society creates, so there's no way of judging it independently. The ruler is the ultimate author and source of all the laws. However, Han Feizi did provide criteria for effective laws. Laws should be clear, consistent, and backed up by significant rewards and punishments. And this is, though, not justified with reference to some heavenly law, but rather justified with respect to what will actually benefit the ruler and create order in society. Han Feizi also had a set of advice for rulers that seems to be based on earlier Huang Lao Jia. This was the early form of Taoism, which included advice for rulers. But Han Feizi reinterprets the Taoist concepts in a completely new way. So Wu, which means emptiness or nothingness, is interpreted by Han Feizi as the ruler not revealing what he desires or intends. So as opposed to just emptying your mind of thoughts or desires, like in Taoism, the ruler is just kind of keeping his cards close to his chest for strategic purposes. Wu Wei, or not doing, in Taoism was a kind of spontaneous action that was effortless and effective. But in Han Feizi's philosophy and that of the legalists, Wu Wei means the ruler should delegate their authority to ministers. So he's not having to act because he's delegated the authority. And when he chooses the right people, they'll be effective. But then the ruler should take credit for their work in order to make it seem like everything was actually caused by him. So you can see there's a kind of a cynical edge to this sort of political philosophy. Lisi was a minister in Qin Shihuang's imperial government. He was actually the chief minister or advisor, the prime minister. He did a lot of things to unify the country. He standardized the written form of Chinese. He created standard weights measures throughout the empire. And this really helped unify the culture and society even after the end of the Qin Dynasty. He was a follower of Fa Jia, or the school of the law, and Lisi also had the view that political philosophy should not be something that scholars write about. It was seen as something that was a threat to the emperor's authority, because the emperor is the only one who should decide what the policy is, and other people in the society should not have an opinion about what the emperor should do. It's a challenge, an implicit challenge to the emperor's authority, according to Lisi. Consequently, at least according to the traditional account, he ordered the destruction of any books touching on politics and burying of scholars who were authoring such books or who didn't cooperate. And while the details of this, or exactly how much was done, has been disputed by modern scholars, it's definitely true that a lot of the texts of the Warring States and earlier Zhou period were lost as a result of the chaos that surrounded the Qin Dynasty. So a lot of historical records, as well as books on politics, were just destroyed. Lisi was an admirer of Han Feizi, the legalist philosopher. However, because before the Qin Dynasty had been founded across all China, before the Warring States had been unified, Han Feizi was in the service of another king from outside the state of Qin. So Lisi regarded him as a potential threat. He actually invited Han Feizi basically on a diplomatic mission to the state of Qin. But while he was there, Lisi ordered Han Feizi imprisoned. His reasoning was that if he was allowed to go back to the state that he worked for, that would be a threat to the state of Qin. But also, if he were allowed to work for the state of Qin, Han Feizi could be a threat to Lisi himself because of his great intellect and craft in the art of legislation and politics. Therefore, Lisi basically made life so difficult for Han Feizi that he was able to persuade him to commit suicide. You can see the sort of cynical power plays going on. These continued even after the state of Qin conquered the rest of the warring states. So after the death of the first Qin emperor, Lisi conspired with a palace eunuch, Chao Gao, to deprive the rightful heir Fusu from the throne. Fusu was close to another scholar whom Lisi feared might be appointed the prime minister, so he didn't want to lose any of his power. This conspiracy was effective, and so Qin Shi was created as the second Qin emperor instead of Fusu. However, after this had been done, Lisi was himself betrayed by Chao Gao. Chao Gao had become close to Qin Shi when he served as his tutor, basically, or his teacher, his mentor. And so the second Qin emperor believed Chao Gao when he told him that Lisi was a traitor and had to be executed. So Lisi was tortured, confessed to being a traitor under torture, even though he hadn't really attempted to overthrow the dynasty, and he was executed by a very painful method called waist chop, in which you're literally chopped in two from the waist. And ironically, Lisi had used this technique before on a lot of his political enemies, but in the end, he ended up suffering the same fate himself.